I want to bring in my guests. We are joined with my man. I know it's late there, so I greatly appreciate you joining me this time of night. Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson, he is a writer, internationalist, academic, director of Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. Tim, man, how you doing today? You doing okay today?
Good, thanks, Jamal. Yeah, good to see you again.
So I got a question for you. Am I insane in this point that it seems like the military capabilities of Hamas, the capabilities of Ansarullah have gotten markedly more precise ever since the 12-day war? And I haven't necessarily heard it brought up in the news. I haven't even heard it brought up necessarily on other channels per se. But I'm bringing it up because I watch people get killed every day, whether it's in Gaza or whether it's Israeli soldiers, whether it's in Ukraine, whatever. And I've seen a marked uptick in the ambushes or the explosions or the attacks that are taking place in Gaza against the IDF. Am I insane in this? Give me your thoughts on this.
Okay, so you're talking about Palestinian resistance and also Yemen, which are, of course, linked. They do talk to each other, but I think that we're talking about a couple of different things here, really. And in relation to the 12-day war, you're talking about what sort of damage the Iranians did to the Israeli infrastructure.
Yes.
The Israelis have made some partial admissions on this. You pointed out that there was the Iranians had also hit the US base in Qatar, the Al Udeid base, which is the biggest US military base in the Arab world, basically, hosted by our Gulf friends in Qatar. Let's start with Gaza, because you're right, I think, to say that there's an upsurge in the effectiveness of the resistance in Gaza. What's this come from? Now, from the point of view of Hamas, and let's remember, Hamas is probably the lead group, but there's at least half a dozen Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza and broader Palestine. Hamas may be the biggest, but Palestine Islamic Jihad, their one Al-Quds brigades, and Fatah has two armed groups, Al-Asifa and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. So they've been active for all the time since October 2023. And then there's some smaller ones. There's a Popular Front, the socialist groups, militia, and a few smaller ones too. Now, when it comes to Hamas, we know that Hamas has recruited young people, replaced most of the 13 to 15,000 losses they've suffered over the last 2 years. And recently they've appointed a new set of field commanders. So they have good communications restored there. They have new field commanders, some of whom are experienced, with many young operatives, basically. But the attacks that were made recently in Shujaa and Beit Hanun, I think you mentioned Beit Hanun, were really carried out by Al-Qassam, the Hamas militia. And so they're better organized, they've got better intelligence, they've announced that they've got more precise intelligence, and they've been carried out more complex operations with snipers, with improvised explosive devices, which are, by the way, usually unexploded ordnance dropped on them by the Israelis, these very big US bombs, sometimes half-ton bombs. If they don't explode, they'll rig them up for improvised explosive devices there. And they've also been trying to capture some POWs, some of the Israelis too. I'm not sure whether they were successful, but they have killed a number recently in Shujaa and Beit Hanun, quite a number, and between killed and wounded, we're talking about something like 50 or 60 in those two places. So they've been quite successful operations, basically resisting the invaders there. So that's on the part of the Palestinian resistance. There's still capacity there, enormously courageous, enormously resilient, despite the huge reprisals against civilians in Gaza that we all know about. Basically, that's been the major tool that the Israelis have had to try and intimidate any resistance by simply wiping out civilians, and they're doing it 50 to 100 a day. Including, of course, as we know, mowing down civilians who are queuing up to get food aid by this Gaza humanitarian force, which is a mercenary force, which pretends to be humanitarian, trying to fill the gap left by the exclusion of the UN UNRWA agency, which used to provide aid there, but in fact becoming part of the killing machine there. Now you turn to Yemen. Yemen, of course, has upped the ante to, the Yemenis have said for quite a long time that they don't need anyone's permission to intervene directly against the Israelis. They were bombed themselves by the Israelis and they manage. The ports have been bombed. The ports were bombed before I visited Yemen in February this year, but they bombed them again in Hodeidah port and the Ras Isa port at the north, which was getting fuel, and also the bulk grain carriers were coming into Hodeidah. So they bombed a lot of things that affect civilians in Yemen. The Israelis don't have very good intelligence on Yemeni military and where they place their things. They call them Houthi rebels, which is what I think you commented on this, that how are these people in sandals that are called rebels sending hypersonic missiles into occupied Palestine? Well, they're a revolutionary government. They're not rebels, basically. They have the capacity of a revolutionary government. They've controlled at least 75% of the populated areas of Yemen for the last 10 years, for the last 10 years, since 2015. So it's misleading that the Western media keeps calling them Houthi rebels. They have this capacity. They've developed themselves. Okay, they've got some ideas. They've got some technological ideas from Hezbollah, from Iran, but they're building those things. I've seen the models of them in Hodeidah Museum, for example, those the Palestine 2 missiles, which travels at 16 times the speed of sound. That helps explain why it's difficult for the defenses in Israel to knock down these types of missiles, and why they have the precise capacity to hit ships, as you pointed out. I think they've upped the ante with the ships recently because they had deterred a lot of shipping from going through, but there are some they call recalcitrants that keep going back to try and supply the Israelis, and they've imposed a quarantine. They've imposed a quarantine on genocide. They say we have this moral obligation according to our Quranic understanding, and also according to our legal understanding, that there is a convention that Yemen signed some time ago. They're called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And states that sign that don't need permission from anyone to intervene to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. That's why they're doing their operations in the Red Sea now. And when the British and the US went in to try and stop them, they gave up after they'd lost a few jets and lost a couple of dozen Reaper drones, and were basically chased out of the Red Sea. So the Yemenis have their own effective capacity there. They may be getting help, in finance and technology from Iran, but the missiles are made in Iran. One shop owner in Yemen, when I was trying to buy some clothes, said, "Look, all the clothes here made are rubbish. The only good thing we make in Yemen are missiles," basically, because a lot of the clothes were made in China. That's why he was trying to deter me from buying Yemeni-made clothes at the time. So they do make these missiles that are proving very effective. And usually they've not been sinking boats, they've been deterring warships. The warships have got exhausted. I think what happened with the aircraft carriers, they got exhausted. They were on alert the whole time, even though none of the US or British warships were sunk, but they were harassed and they were eventually chased out of the Red Sea. And I think then Trump tried to declare victory and then retreated, basically, because it was costing him a lot of money and putting a lot of stress on the crews there. Up until recently, there hadn't been any merchant marine people killed, but apparently in the second boat there were a couple killed there. Normally the Yemenis are helping evacuate these boats, but they found that the boat, the one that you're showing at the moment, I think they were saying it was recalcitrant. It was going in and supplying, it was a bulk carrier supplying the Israelis, and they'd warned them many times that this was not permitted. There was a quarantine and they were breaching the quarantine. So I'm not sure of this ship or the other one that a few seamen were killed on, basically. But so Yemen has its own capacity there, and which is a little bit distinct from the resistance in Gaza. But of course, however courageous and persistent the resistance in Palestine is, it's insufficient in itself to inflict a crushing blow on the Israeli military. They've inflicted a lot of pain on the military, but they need their regional resistance partners like Iran and Yemen to help with finally delivering a crushing blow to this apartheid regime.
I'm curious. Thank you for that. Great breakdown. I really appreciate it. Did the 12-day war create weaknesses in the Israeli military that is allowing this new effectiveness? I had and I guess the two things. The reason why I connected all of these things together, because technically all of these things are together in a way, even though they're different in their own sphere. The war between Iran and Israel, obviously, that's one sphere. The war between, let's say, the resistance groups in Israel, that's another sphere, but both of those things are going after Israel. And from the standpoint of Ansar Allah, they're trying to prevent supplies from getting into Israel. So the reason I linked them was because all of those things were in relation to Israel, even though I agree with you, they're different
Good
spheres.
point. It's a good point, and I haven't heard anyone raising it before. It's a very good point because we know, while the Israelis have tried to hide it, because everyone knows they've got very tough military censorship, and only these partial revelations recently have sort of admitted some things that they were forced to admit, because I think some of the British Telegraph and some other Anglo-American NGO had pointed out that there were at least these five bases hit. We know also the Haifa refinery was smashed. It's not back in operation yet. That was providing most of the fuel to the Israeli military. And there's some question going on in Israel at the moment about whether they can reopen the refinery after all this damage or move it somewhere else. So it may be that they've got some problems with fuel there, with fuel supply. We know that their communication centers were hit too. We don't know exactly, because the Israelis are very careful to hide it, what damage is done. But I think you've got a very good point that really they must be facing some weaknesses now with their infrastructure being hit, with their military bases, with their intelligence operations, with their Mossad being hit. There's a lot of their infrastructure that's been hit. We don't know exactly what this means. The Israelis themselves have pointed out, in relation to the attacks in Gaza, the deadly attacks in Gaza by the resistance, was that the soldiers were suffering heat and humidity. So maybe the European colonists are having some trouble with the climate in Gaza. Basically, that was their one excuse. But I think you're right. There's something more to it than that. There's been some serious weaknesses opened up with the military and its supply and its coordination, perhaps, because really, if the resistance in Gaza have improved their intelligence, it looks like the Israelis have gone downhill in that respect, basically, and that must have something to do with communications, with supply, and so on as well.
That's funny. When we used to play chess, and the guy used to lose, he was like, "Oh, the wind got in my eye. The sun hit me in the moment that I was about to make my move." The idea that they have been starving people, they have nukes, they have all of this money from the US, they have all the weapon systems that they want in the world, and they're like, the heat was bothering me. It wasn't bothering the people who we were fighting, but it was bothering us.
They were getting sunburned, I think.
Yeah, right. So another thing that has come out has to do with plans for Gaza. And I want to know whether you think this is going to work. So they're going to build a concentration camp. They've already been using the food distribution areas as killing fields. But apparently Netanyahu, and Trump agrees with this. So anybody who's trying to say that there's some kind of disagreement between Trump and Netanyahu, nonsense. Trump himself came out saying he wanted to expel the people who were there. So right here, according to the plan, each Gazan entering the humanitarian zone will undergo inspection to ensure they're carrying no weapons and are not affiliated with Hamas. Consequently, those outside these zones will later be identified as Hamas terrorists, providing legal justification for their elimination. So anybody who is outside of the concentration camp can be murdered with a quote unquote clear conscience, because by definition of them not volunteering to go into a concentration camp, they're obviously Hamas. This is what they're trying to sell. Now, I don't know why they have to sell anything. They've been on a murder spree for the last several years. And, the death toll easily is over 100,000, if not more. Do you think this is going to work? I mean, they're talking about either killing or expelling 1.8 million people.
Look, you're right. Why do they need this pretext? They're still trying to wage some sort of soft power war. They lost their soft power with the genocide. We know that the world has turned against them, not just the global south. Most of the populations in the global north, most of the population in North America now, in the US also, has turned against them. They've lost that. Maybe they're trying to grab something back. But as you said, they've been killing civilians and boasting about killing civilians and children. They've been boasting about this for almost 2 years. This is, of course, the root of the genocide case in the International Court of Justice, that there's all these officials and ministers who've been boasting about their, Amalek, and they were going to wipe these people out because, I mean, it's true. All the Palestinians hate them. There's no doubt about that. And all the young kids are going to join the resistance groups. That's true, So in a sense, they're saying every child is a terrorist. It's self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? If you act as a Nazi, as they are, basically, and I think the parallel with the Nazis is a very good one. It's a very salutary one, really, because they should be ashamed. They should be ashamed linked by the people that persecuted Jews in the past. This links us very close. You have a racial ideology. That racial ideology creates an apartheid system. It creates the rationale to eliminate people simply because they're part of this so-called racial group or terrorist group, they want to call it. Why do they need a rationale to say people are terrorists if they're outside a certain zone? They've been killing them in every zone there. And they pushed them down to the south, remember, in the past, to Rafah. Then the people went back to the north and they tried to bomb them in the north. They're still occupying Gaza. People think Gaza's been destroyed. No, actually, Gaza is still populated by these people. And I've seen this in other places, in Yarmouk, for example, in Syria, where when that was destroyed after a war with ISIS, people go back very quickly. They find shelter. They look for fresh water. People survive in these circumstances. These people are still surviving. Even if they're being starved, they're still looking to preserve their shelter, get access to fresh water, get access to food. This is still happening. It's not like there's no life there. The people in Gaza are still there, so trying to herd them into one other part of Gaza and put up a new fence around them, that already existed. That's what Gaza was. Gaza was set up as a type of concentration camp because most of those people, the families or their parents or grandparents, the parents and grandparents of the resistance fighters in Gaza came from what they call 48 Palestine, which they call Israel these days, or the Green Zone, where the first part that they colonized before they took over the whole of historic Palestine. So the Gaza concentration camp is going to be reduced. They keep talking about buffer zones. They talk about buffer zones in Lebanon, in Syria, in various parts of Palestine. There are members of the government that want to annex the whole of the West Bank, but the whole of the West Bank's been effectively annexed for the last 55 years or 57 years, whatever it is. So it's really not clear who they're trying to impress with these sorts of things. The population has been turned into a fascist population. 80% of them support what's going on in Gaza and want more of it to happen. But who are they trying to impress with this idea that people will be legal targets if they're outside some new fence post there? The whole of Palestine, I was there some years ago, it's not just like one wall that's separating the 48 Palestine from the rest. There are fences everywhere. All of the settlements across the West Bank have fences. They have fences around feeder roads. They have the place is like throttled by, it's like a briar patch, with all the thorns and everything, strangling the whole of Palestine. If you want to go from Ramallah to Bethlehem, Beit Laham, then you have to go a very, very long way. There's no direct route there. A lot of these places were accessible in the past, but all the fences and walls that the Israelis have built have really throttled it for everyone that's living there. And it's such a complex system of apartheid that even the Israeli officials don't actually know what the rules are in many cases. I'm talking about the West Bank now, but Gaza, to talk about a new set of walls and fences doesn't change much at all. They're trying to herd people into a certain area and mow them down or starve them. Basically, there's no sense in which they're going to treat people well within a concentration camp, which has more restricted walls. I'm not sure how the people are going to comply. They'll just bomb them more and deny them more aid. They're not allowing proper aid in at the moment. I don't know what the incentive is for people to go into these more restricted areas.
What's the end goal? And I know that's somewhat of and maybe it's not as a wide question as I think it is when I asked it. But ultimately, what's the objective in this? I mean, it seems like either you're going to kill 1.8 million people, or you're going to somehow expel 1.8 million people. And up to this point, they have not indicated where they're going to expel them to. So you're stuck with killing 1.8 million people, which seems beyond Israel's capabilities.
Yeah, it's beyond your take on that. They're still getting killed by resistance, by young men in the resistance in Gaza. So really their capacity to erect new fences within fences is going to be constrained by the fact that the people putting up those fences are going to be shot too. It's like the feeder roads in the West Bank. That everyone in a fenced-off feeder road in the West Bank to a colony is an Israeli settler, and therefore they can snipe them at night. They'll snipe them in Gaza as they're trying to put up these new fences, basically. It's beyond their capacity, but they would like to expel them. It's what the Nazis wanted to do. The Nazis didn't start out wanting to kill all the Jews in Germany or in German-occupied Europe. They wanted to expel them, and one of the things they did was to help the Zionists expel Palestinian people, Jewish people to Palestine. They minted some coins about that, the transfer agreement they called, the Havara agreement, to transfer money and people out of Germany. By the way, this was against the main Jewish organizations in Germany at the time which wanted to boycott the Nazi regime. They knew they were anti-Jewish party. They knew they were in for trouble. But the initial years were all about trying to deport people, to move Jewish people out of Nazi-occupied Europe, basically. Now you have Netanyahu following in that model, talking about trying to deport people. He doesn't care where they go. He wants to find someone to host them. The same with Trump. In a sense, here's the other thing. We talk about Trump, but Trump has shown himself to be irrelevant to this situation. What has changed from Biden to Trump in what's going on in Gaza? Well, they called him Genocide Joe Biden. You know, what has Trump done that's any different, really? Everything, Netanyahu, have everything you want. Here's some more weapons. Trump is still doing that. So he's become, he portrayed himself as an agent of change, but he's become irrelevant. The deep state in Washington is doing what it was doing under Biden, basically, and for that matter, in Ukraine too. What's changed there, basically, still weapons are going to Ukraine. So in Gaza, they would like them to go anywhere. There's great resistance from even the collaborating regimes, even Egypt, which has collaborated very closely with the Israelis and the US. Sisi doesn't want a huge Palestinian population in Egypt. It's going to be trouble for him, basically. It's going to create a great domestic problems for him there. Jordan has a lot. They don't want more. There's resistance from Jordan and from Egypt, which are the two compliant regimes, basically. We don't know about the Al-Qaeda boss in Damascus yet. Maybe he'll be more compliant, but it's a bit of a way from Gaza to Syria at this moment. I don't see any Arab regimes that are keen to take a large number of Palestinian population. They know it's going to be trouble for them. It's going to be, the populations are very sympathetic. The Arab populations are very sympathetic to the Palestinian people, but the regimes themselves don't want it, that they can see more trouble. They've already got trouble. The Egyptian people are very pro-Palestinian, but they're not happy with the fact that Sisi's been collaborating so closely with the Israelis there. So there are ways in which, of course, from Egypt, some weapons have got into Gaza, because of those sympathetic networks, basically. But it's not easy to see where they might deport these people to. I think Trump has put out some feelers. Netanyahu has put out some feelers. Maybe they can deport some to parts of Europe, but it's not obvious. From the point of view of Netanyahu, it doesn't matter. He just wants them out, basically, so that they can colonize the areas, basically. And there's still an ongoing push, let's remember, in the West Bank. There is active acts of ethnic cleansing going on around Nablus. There's resistance in Nablus. There's resistance in Jenin, in Hebron, which is a heavily divided apartheid city. There are plans to try and annex more of Hebron too. So really, it's a generalized campaign. The Israelis seem to be still constrained in some way. Although they've lost their soft power, they seem to be still constrained to try and put up some sort of pretext for their supporters outside, those few that remain, to say, look, this is really all legit and the Palestinian people are going to be better off. And Trump is just echoing those sorts of messages. Trump doesn't seem to be taking an initiative. When someone asked him in Washington, when Netanyahu was there, he just flicked it to Netanyahu to answer it, basically. So he's not really even pretending to be someone who's taking a lead, although Netanyahu's saying the right things to try and placate Trump's enormous ego by saying, he's leading us and so on, but he's not really doing anything any different to what Biden was doing before him, basically.
Yeah, it's even worse because Trump is saying ludicrous things that make no sense. Like, for example, he would say, oh, the people in Gaza, they've suffered so much. They've suffered so much. And it's like, dude, you're paying 80% of a genocide. Like, meaning you're putting money, bombs, weapons. You were arguing in front of the ICJ that it was okay to starve 1.8 million people. That's pretty astonishing for you to then turn around and say, oh, they suffered so much. You were the cause of their suffering in real terms, right? I am also curious on something else. So can you explain, is Israel overextended? Let me start there first before I go to the next point, because I want to nail this part down before I move over into Lebanon. But is Israel overextended? I mean, they're in Syria, they're in Lebanon, they're in the West Bank, obviously. They've expanded into Gaza. They've tried to attack Iran. That didn't necessarily go all that well. And so they seem to have doubled down in Lebanon. But it's a country of 8 million people. How are they pulling this off? And this is on top of an economy that seems to be non-existent if it's functioning at all.
Well, they're enormously propped up by their foreign support. Basically, the money and the weapons from the US, from Britain, from Germany. Let's remember, Germany is a major arms supplier to the Israelis too. So I think, ever since October the 7th, 2023, they have been relying very heavily on this foreign support. They could not have sustained even what they're doing in Gaza if they had not had this enormous support. What is it, $4 billion a year from the US? And then on top of that, the new weapons supplies. I mean, they're stocking up on weapons now for the second round with Iran, it seems, which is going to come in a month or two, basically. But why they want a second round with Iran? What do you call a fighter who goes back into the second round having been smashed in the first?
Right there. Isn't it fascinating?
I don't think they were smashed. I think the Israelis that are fleeing to Cyprus, I think probably they think they were smashed, the ones that lost their homes and so on. But somehow, if you look at the Israeli media, they are claiming victory. They are saying, look, we hit Iran and we forced Trump to join in and hit them too for the first time. And look, they're saying, look, the Iranians were targeting civilians in Israel, even though they admit that 28 people were killed in Israel and 930 something were killed in Iran. They're still claiming that they had the targeted attacks and the Iranians were targeting residential areas. So some strange myth building going on amongst the minds, at least, of the Israeli elite and the Israeli media, to say we proved our technological superiority because we killed these Iranian commanders and we did this and that and the other thing. Both sides, of course, are consolidating their assets at the moment. What you said before about China, I think, is true. China has been helping Iran with its missile program. That means components, and with their navigation systems, as you say, moving from the US GPS system across to the Chinese system, whose name escapes me. So they're getting, and there's a question of their air defenses and their fighter jets, because there were delays in getting the Russian ones, the Su-35s. They're apparently looking at getting the Chinese ones now. We don't know exactly what's happening there. But of course, Iran is consolidating its assets there. They have some very good, of course, missile technology of their own. From the Israeli side, of course, they're trying to replenish their military assets, and including their interception assets, because they're very expensive. Being US technology is more expensive than the rest of the technology in the world, than the Russian or the Iranian or the Chinese. Doesn't mean it's better, but it's very expensive. And so it looks impressive on paper, the Israeli military, I mean, but of course they're trying to stock up on all of those. Some people have done these calculations. They've said every time an Iranian missile comes in, the Iranian missile costs them 100,000 or 200,000 or something, and the missiles sent up to interceptor cost $500,000 or $1 million or something like that. So it's sort of course, that doesn't matter too much, because most of the world is supporting the US economy by using the US dollar at the moment. Yeah. We know there's this artificial inflation of the dollar there, and effectively, whether it was Biden or Trump, they're just giving the Israelis what they need at the moment. So they'll be stocking up on these expensive air defense systems. And of course, we know that the Iranian missiles were also, there were attempts to intercept them from Jordan, from other parts of the Persian Gulf and so on, before they even got to occupied Palestine. So there's a concerted effort. The British and perhaps the French and the others are helping in this sort of air defense, but it's expensive and they need to stock up. And frankly, the US military industrial system is not that efficient at production these days. We saw what happened with Ukraine, that they weren't able to supply Kiev with the sort of weapons they wanted. Trump had some reluctance at first. Now it seems he's capitulated. He's gone back to the Biden line effectively on Ukraine. He's doing that there, but they can't produce as fast as Russia can produce there. And in the Iranian circumstances, I think that the Iranians are they already had a very huge stockpile, because Iran was always expecting and worrying about the escalation of any war with the Israelis. They knew that they could deal with the Israelis, but the problem was, would the US and the rest of NATO join in the war? And then they had to prepare for effectively a war with the US, which is a much bigger deal for them. So they have a big stockpile of missiles, but I suspect they're addressing some of their gaps too in this time. People are talking about now maybe the second round. Israel will launch another aggression perhaps in September, late August or September, something like that, because it'll take them a while to stock up there.
That seems like madness.
Yeah, but this.
And the reason why I say that, when I used to talk to people before about this, I would say, but Israel knows it's going to get hit, correct? And they say, yes, they don't care. And it's like, how could they not care? And that's kind of the same thing with this. Iran was very restrained in the way it was going after Israel. And the people who I've talked to, they were Iranians. It was a very frustrating conversation because from their point of view, they're like, well, we want to be moral in war. And it's like, dude, what are you talking about? They're hitting your hospitals. They're hitting police stations in order to free prisoners. They were trying to overthrow your government. This wasn't just rando war. This was a planned attempt at overthrowing the government of Iran. I guess you can say on the positive side, Israel expended a lot of the internal assets that they could have used to do this. And so those assets are probably off the table, at the very least, many of them are. But on the negative side, you're dealing with a nuclear state. And so I suppose on some level you have to be restrained when you're going after them because there's always a subjective level where Israel cries victim and say, well, now we need to employ nuclear weapons. Or do you think that's on the table? Like, meaning, how can I ask this? From my point of view, all notions of norms have been off the table with the genocide. And some people would say, well, nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons will break a norm that the rest of the world wouldn't tolerate. And I would say, well, yeah, but they say that genocide wouldn't be something that the rest of the world would tolerate either. The rest of the world seems to have accommodated the fact that they're murdering people in mass pretty readily. Are nukes off the table in usage? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a red line or is that not a red line?
Look, we've had this consensus, I suppose, that those with nukes in the past have been rational people in some way and understood that there could be consequences, like a boxing match. You don't go into a ring and throw a punch expecting not to get hit yourself. You start a nuclear war, then there's a good chance you're going to get hit yourself, basically. And so you can give one, can you take one? That's the problem generally. But I think the other idea behind it, and this applies to the US as much as to Israel, is that it's an option that they might consider if they're losing badly, if they're losing very badly, rather than be annihilated. It's something they may resort to. The other side to that is, how can a nuke be any sort of deterrent unless other people think you're mad enough to use it, basically? And I think that's partly the diplomatic strategy the North Koreans had. That the North Koreans, they're very smart people, actually, but I think they cultivated this diplomatic approach, which is different to Iran, that be afraid of us because we're crazy and we'll do anything if you try and hurt us, basically. And the problem is that with Iran, and this is one reason why I don't think the Iranians would develop a nuclear weapon, they've told themselves and the rest of the world for more than 30 years, probably 40 years, that nuclear weapons are immoral because they're very indiscriminate. They're going to also, they'll kill a lot of collateral people. They don't want to attack. And then also they'll start if they get one, they'll start an arms race amongst these Persian Gulf monarchies and so on like that. So the problem is, the Iranians have been so moral in effect. No one is going to believe that they're going to use a nuke, even if they have one. I think that's the problem. How could it be a deterrent for Iran, who's told everyone for like 4 decades that it's immoral to use nukes? Okay, they change the fatwa and they say we'll do one because our state's at risk. But who's going to believe that they're going to use it? The Israelis had an idea. It was called the Samson option. About the idea that Samson pulls down the temple on his head and kills himself and everyone else, basically. But what we know is that the Israelis are not actually suicidal. They're very sensitive to being killed themselves. And this is why the Hezbollah and the Palestinian resistance have taken prisoners of war that they call hostages, because they know that the Israelis are very sensitive. And the only way that they've got prisoners released from the Israeli dungeons these days, and it's an apartheid system, there's no justice there, and a large part of the people are held without charge or trial. The only way they get people out in the past in Palestine and the Lebanese was to have a prisoner exchange, basically. That's why Hezbollah took prisoners of war, captured soldiers. That's probably why just recently Hamas was trying to capture some of these soldiers rather than just kill them, because they figured, well, we can get some of our comrades out of prison, basically. So the Israelis are not so crazy unless of course, they're going to be annihilated. Either they're going to leave, they're going to flee like refugees, as they are now. There's a lot that have gone to Cyprus apparently, but they can't get out by the airport. The airports are shut, the ports are shut, but there's some yachts going from the beaches, So they'll find some ways to escape. Are the elite who are going to stay to the end going to sacrifice themselves? I don't think so. Would they use nukes as a last resort? Apparently they're in submarines, they're in some other places. Of course, they're deeply embedded with the British military and perhaps the German military also, which is interesting because it means that the German military effectively has nukes, which people didn't really know about. But apparently from recent revelations, it seems like the Germans are also helping them with concealing nukes. It's hard to say. We assume that people, maybe we were all wrong to assume that those with nukes were rational people. Basically, this is the sad thing about it. We don't really know, but the US is the only regime that's used nukes in war and used it against civilian cities in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the US has shown itself to be ruthless. But that was at a time when the US had a monopoly on nuclear weapons.
Right.
We don't see. There was a suggestion that they might use them in the Korean War in the early 50s, but at that stage, I think the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons that maybe China didn't. So it's hard to say really. Maybe we've all been wrong assuming that people are rational, and the Israelis with what they've done, as you say, of course, genocide seems not to have been a red line to their sponsors, at least. We know that their sponsors.
It's a hard question. It is a hard question. I mean, I guess for me, nukes are meant to be seen, not used. They're used as kind of like, hey, don't mess with me. I have nukes. And for Iran, I honestly think it is a dereliction of responsibility to the country for them not to have nukes, considering the neighborhood that they're in. But you're right. They take this weird point of view. Well, these are immoral weapons, and so we don't want to use these immoral weapons. And it's like, dude, they are trying to take your head. Yeah, but we want to stay moral. It's not about morality. It's about the state. Like the state's first and foremost responsibility is to maintain the integrity of the state. This morality stuff that they keep leaning on is not a self-preservation mechanism in the way that I think they may think it is.
Well, and I guess they're certainly not going to use the first strike capability. If they had them, I suppose the one resort you might say was if they are hit themselves, because Iran is a big country and it's conceivable that it could absorb a nuclear strike on one other part and launch nukes from another part, basically. So retaliation, maybe there's some argument to be made that they have it up their sleeves in retaliation, whereas the Israeli territory is very small, very confined, basically. And that's in some ways why the infrastructure has been hit so relatively easily. And of course, also there's been all this collateral damage because all of their military facilities and intelligence facilities are in populated areas in the so-called green zone in Israel, basically. So of course there was damage to residential areas in so-called Israel, basically. But maybe there's some deterrence in Iran having a nuclear weapon so that it can retaliate if it is hit with a nuclear weapon, or alternatively, the way they talk about it in nuclear armed states, if they detect the launch of a nuclear weapon coming to them, they can retaliate in that form. But they are amongst the most prominent of the moral objectors, the conscientious objectors to nuclear weapons. And so it's not really a great deterrent to have one. They're not going to use it as a first strike there, basically. But maybe there's some argument that there could be a deterrent there. Up until now, they haven't changed that fatwa, but there's been some discussion, of course, because Iranian people are very frustrated, and they've been frustrated by what they see as the reticence or the weakness of some of their political leaders, particularly, I suppose, the more liberal government they have at the moment. What the Israeli attack on June the 13th did was bring the Iranian people together to say, no, we have to defend ourselves against these monsters, these Israelis. So there was a great deal of national unity there. I think the way it ended, the way Trump forced an end to it by unilaterally declaring a ceasefire when there was no agreement, was that the Iranians were proceeding on the assumption that they were relying on Article 51 of the UN Charter of Self-Defense to defend themselves against the Israelis. But there is not yet a strong, and I think this is actually a responsibility a lot of the rest of us have who support the Palestinian people, is to promote the idea that there is an international responsibility to dismantle this apartheid regime, because it's an apartheid regime that is the root of the genocide. I know a lot of people think the first priority is to stop the genocide that's a daily occurrence now in Gaza, but the problem is it's come from an apartheid regime. And if that apartheid, there's a responsibility for the international community to dismantle an apartheid regime. But at the moment, there is not a strong consensus to say all of these factions, even the resistance factions, are carrying out their operations to do that. But the Palestinian resistance has a very strong argument to say we are defending ourselves and our communities from these invaders, from these monsters. The Iranians are saying the same. But where is the political will internationally to say Yemen has it? Yemen is, but even Yemen is saying we will stop if the genocide in Gaza stops and aid gets into Gaza. So even Yemen has imposed some limits on what they're going to do. But really, what should be happening is a concerted effort to dismantle this regime, basically, because that's the root of the evil that's going on there.
Tim, I am so sick of hearing about international law. I don't believe it exists. I think we're in a jungle, and the only law there is your capability to defend yourself or not. And all of these other groups that are fighting as a resistance are trying to defend themselves in many respects. Like, meaning, when I hear this notion that, well, Iran was dependent upon Article 51, it's like, dude, no, you defend yourself. That's what you do.
Well,
one last thing on this.
What happened was they said, and I think the president said, Pezeshkian said that if the Israelis stop, we will stop. And that's what happened. And Trump saved the Israelis in that sense by forcing them to stop and then, claiming victory or something like that. But it happened. The Iranians stopped after, and they didn't agree to a ceasefire. They just stopped the of the Israelis, basically. So in a sense, Trump effectively made use of that. The Israelis were given a pause, basically, to rearm, to get their defense capacity back. Yeah.
Which is the question of why they stopped in the first place. Like,
they said they would stop. If the Israelis stopped, they said they would stop. That's why I'm saying.
I know, but that's my point.
It doesn't get rid of the problem.
Exactly, because Israel is just going to rearm and do it again. Israel has never attended to a ceasefire.
This is why the Russians didn't agree, by the way, to a truce in Ukraine. They said, no, we want something that's going to last. We want a permanent solution there. We're not going to go back, letting them rearm as they did in 2015 and start all over again and attack the Russian people in southeast Ukraine, basically. So Russians didn't agree to that for that same reason. Unfortunately, the Russians are compromised when it comes to Israel.
What is the point of the secondary attacks if Israel launches again? I mean, obviously they're going to get hit. Iran showed that they can get through their air defense. I mean, cut through it like butter. Hell, the United States knew that Iran was going to fire at the Al Adud base, and Iran still hit their target. And so, I mean, how can I ask this? Does Israel really believe a country of 8 million versus a country that is 3 times the size of Iraq, that it is somehow going to win that? And I guess my question becomes, like, why do they think they're going to win that?
Well, they're relying on Big Brother to back them up, and they're jubilant that they incited Trump, whether they had an agreement before, I'm not sure, but they incited Trump to join in. And while outside observers might say, well, Trump saved their skin because, their fuel tank was showing close to empty on all of these assets that they had, they're thinking that they succeeded. Like, there's 2 different ways to look at the first round here. Basically, the Iranians think they succeeded. The Israelis think they succeeded because they got Trump involved. They think that if they do it again and if it escalates further, Trump will get more deeply involved. They've always been paranoid, by the way, about betrayal by the US, but Netanyahu has been very crafty. He's been trying to present Trump as the great leader and going to Washington recently, probably preparing him for the next round and lining things up there. But so they think that the US is going to come in and save them again if things get worse.
Do you think that? Because Trump is weird on this. I mean, if you remember, Trump came out and said, all right, it's all done. Because he was using nuclear weapons as a stalking horse. I think Trump would have been perfectly fine overthrowing the government on the cheap. But when he realized my colony is being destroyed, they're taking a lot of damage, We need to get involved, and I'm going to use pretext of a nuclear bomb to do so. Well, Trump destroyed his pretext when he so definitively, beat it into the ground, yelled at reporters for even questioning whether or not there was any nuclear material left. He's like, it's all done. They're gone. We've destroyed it completely. It's been obliterated. We've used all of these bunker buster bombs back to back to back to back. Everything is gone. It's over with. We're done. And Israel was like, no, it's not. Meaning there was a dichotomy, which is funny to me.
He gave them a break, because they were running on empty basically, and he gave them a break. So in that sense,
but how does the U.S. What is the justification for the U.S.? Meaning, you said, meaning the U.S. said, it's because of their nukes. Trump says we destroyed everything associated with their nukes. Everything is over with. We're done. Netanyahu, as you say, and I agree with you, is preparing for a second round. So how does the U.S. get involved for a second round when Donald Trump beat into the ground so hard that all of the nuclear material is gone? There was no way they could have moved it. It's done. It's over with. It's finished.
But Jamal, that the whole nuclear thing was always a pretext. It was really, it was nothing. It was a fiction basically, because they know that Iran had other much more targeted assets that it could use and has used now against the Israelis basically. So what they wanted always, what Netanyahu wanted always, what the US wanted always, and you remember this under George W. Bush, the same thing was going on. I remember at the time Fidel Castro was very worried because he thought it was going to lead to a nuclear war. And he made some statements back at the time. That was about 2010 with George W. Bush. The whole idea has been to try and disempower Iran as an agent, as a player in that region, because Iran is the biggest, most powerful, most independent player, and the one that was helping the Palestinian resistance, and of course the resistance in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria when there was an independent Syria. So really the aim has always been to disempower Iran in some way, and nukes were just a pretext. Even with Obama, with the JCPOA 10 years ago, there was a little clause in there about missiles that could carry nuclear weapons. So we're trying to open up an argument in those negotiations to try and stop the Iranian missile program as well. And that's the one that really the Israelis suffered from recently, the fact that they developed very effective, very fast, virtually unstoppable missiles, basically, or at least even the Israelis admit, 14% of them were getting through. If that's what the Israelis admit, probably 40% of them were getting through, basically.
Yeah.
But that they want to disempower Iran. Nukes has just been a pretext, like it was a pretext with Libya, like it was a pretext with Iraq, basically, like the chemical weapons are a pretext in Syria. It's the same game they've played every time. It's a bit like, did you ever watch, what was that cartoon, Peanuts, where Lucy would hold the football for Charlie Brown, and Charlie Brown would come and try and kick the football, and Lucy would pull the football away, and Charlie Brown fell on his ass, basically. So it's the same old trick. But Charlie Brown fell for it every time, basically, the weapons of mass destruction thing. It's just a pretext to try and disempower Iran. And they'll invent another pretext.
Tim, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate the great breakdown. Absolutely great breakdown. Tim Anderson, he is a writer, internationalist, academic, director of Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. Tim, fantastic breakdown. Thank you for this. I appreciate it.
See you again.
You have a good one. Be safe. Shout out to Tim. He joined me at the last minute, and so he has my deepest appreciation. That was a fantastic